Chapter 22 of The Mayor's Wife. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynn Thompson. The Mayor's Wife by Anna Katharine Green. Chapter 22. Mercy. Where's my wife? Sleeping, sir, after a day of exhausting emotion. She didn't wire me? No, sir. Perhaps she wasn't able. She was not, Mayor Packard. I must see her. I came as soon as I could, left Warner to fill my place on the platform, and it is the night of nights, too. Why, what's the matter? He had caught me staring over his shoulder at the form drawn up in the doorway. Nothing. I thought you had come alone. No, Mr. Steele is with me. He joined me at noon, just after I had telegraphed home. He has come back to finish the work I assigned him. He has at last discovered, or thinks he has, the real author of those libels. You have something special to say to me? He whispered as I followed him upstairs. Yes, and I think, if I were you, that I should say nothing to Mrs. Packard about Mr. Steele's having returned. And I rapidly detailed the occurrence of the afternoon, ending with Mrs. Packard's explanation to her servants. The mayor showed impatience. "Oh, I cannot bother with such nonsense as that," he declared. "The situation is too serious." I thought so too, when in another moment his wife's door opened and she stepped out upon the landing to meet him. Her eyes fell on Mr. Steele, standing at the foot of the stairs, before they encountered her husband. And though she uttered no cry, and hardly paused in her approach toward the mayor, I saw the heart within her die as suddenly and surely as the flame goes out in a gust of wind. "You!" There was hysteria in the cry. Pray God that the wild note in it was not that of incipient insanity. "How good of you to give up making your great speech tonight, just to see how I have borne this last outrage. You do see, don't you?" Here she drew her form to its full height. "My husband believes me, and it gives me courage to face the whole world. Ah, is that Mr. Steele I see below there? Pardon me, Mr. Steele, if I show surprise. We heard a false report of your illness this afternoon. Henry, hadn't Mr. Steele better come upstairs? I presume you are here to talk over this last dreadful paragraph with me." "It is not necessary for Mr. Steele to join us if you do not wish him to," I heard the mayor whisper in his wife's ear. "Oh, I do not mind," she returned with an indifference whose reality I probably gauged more accurately than he did. "That is good," and he called Mr. Steele up. "You see she is reasonable enough," he muttered in my ear as he motioned me to follow them into the upstairs sitting room, to which she had led the way. "The more heads the better in a discussion of this kind," was the excuse he gave his wife and Mr. Steele as he ushered me in. As neither answered, I considered my presence accepted, and sat down in as remote a corner as offered. Verily the fates were active in my behalf. Mayor Packard was about to close the door when Mrs. Packard suddenly leaped by him with the cry, "There's the baby! She must have heard your voice!" And rushing into the hall, she came back with the child, whom she immediately placed in its father's arms. Then she slowly seated herself. Not until she had done so did she turn to Mr. Steele. "Sit," said she, with a look and gesture her husband would have marvelled at had he not been momentarily occupied with the prattling child. The secretary bowed and complied. Surely men of such great personal attractions are few. Instantly the light, shaded though it seemingly was in all directions, settled on his face, making him, to my astonished gaze, the leading personality in the group. Was this on account of the distinction inherent in extreme beauty, or because of a new and dominating expression which had insensibly crept into his features? The mayor, and the mayor only, seemed oblivious to the fact. Glancing up from the child, he opened the conference by saying, "Tell Mrs. Packard, Steele, what you have just told me." With a quiet shifting of his figure, which brought him into a better line with the woman he was asked to address, the secretary opened his lips to reply when she, starting, reached out one hand and drew toward her the little innocent figure of her child, which she at once placed between herself and him. Seeing this, I recalled the scraps of cipher left in my room above, and wished I had succeeded in determining their meaning, if only to understand the present enigmatical situation. Meanwhile, Mr. Steele was saying, in the mellow tone of a man accustomed to tune his voice to suit all occasions, "Mrs. Packard will excuse me if I seem abrupt. In obedience to commands laid upon me by his Honor, I spent both Tuesday and Wednesday in inquiries as to the origin of the offensive paragraph which appeared in Monday's issue of the Leader. Names were given me, but too many of them. It took me 2 days to sift these down to one, and when I had succeeded in doing this, it was only to find that the man I sought was 90 miles away. Madam, I journeyed those 90 miles to learn that meanwhile he had returned to this city. While I was covering those miles for a second time, today's paragraph appeared. I hastened to accuse its author of libel, but the result was hardly what I expected. Perhaps you know what he said." "No," she harshly returned, "I do not." And with the instinctive gesture of one awaiting attack, she raised her now sleepy and nodding child in front of her laboring breast, with a look in her eyes which I see yet. "He said, pardon me, your Honor, pardon me, madam, that I was at liberty to point out what was false in it." With a leap she was on her feet, towering above us all in her indignation and overpowering revolt against the man who was the conscious instrument of this insult. The child, loosened so suddenly from her arms, tottered and would have fallen had not Mr. Steele leaned forward and drawn the little one across to himself. Mr. Packard, who, we must remember, had been more or less prepared for what his secretary had to say, cast a glance at his wife, teeming with varied emotions. "And what did you reply to that?" were the words she hurled at the unabashed secretary. "Nothing," was his grave reply. "I did not know myself what was false in it." With sudden faltering, Mrs. Packard reseated herself, while the mayor, outraged by what was evidently a very unexpected answer, leaned forward in great anger, crying, "That was not the account you gave me of this wretched interview. Explain yourself, Mr. Steele. Don't you see that your silence at such a moment, to say nothing of the attitude you at present assume, is an insult to Mrs. Packard?" The smile he met in reply was deprecatory enough, so were the words his outburst had called forth. "I did not mean, and do not mean, to insult Mrs. Packard. I am merely showing you how hampered a man is, whatever his feelings, when it comes to a question of facts known only to a lady with whom he has not exchanged 50 words since he came into her house. If Mrs. Packard will be good enough to inform me just how much and how little is true in the paragraph we are considering, I shall see this rascally reporter again, and give him a better answer." Mayor Packard looked unappeased. This was not the way to soothe a woman whom he believed to be greatly maligned. With an exclamation indicative of his feelings, he was about to address some hasty words to the composed, almost smiling man who confronted him, when Mrs. Packard herself spoke with unexpected self-control, if not disdain. "You are a very honest man, Mr. Steele. I commend the nicety of your scruples, and am quite ready to trust myself to them. I own to no blot in my past or present life calling for public arraignment. If my statement of the fact is not enough, I here swear on the head of my child—" "No, no," he quickly interpolated. "Don't frighten the baby. Swearing is not necessary. I am bound to believe your word, Mrs. Packard." And lifting a sheet of paper from a pile lying on the table before him, he took a pencil from his pocket and began making lines to amuse the child dancing on his knee. Mrs. Packard's eyes opened in wonder mingled with some emotion deeper than distaste, but she said nothing, only watched in a fascinated way his moving fingers. The mayor, mollified possibly by his secretary's last words, sank back again in his chair with the remark, "You have heard Mrs. Packard's distinct denial. You are consequently armed for battle. See that you fight well. It is all part of the scheme to break me up. One more paragraph of that kind and I shall be a wreck, even if my campaign is not." "There will not be any more." "Ah, can you assure me of that?" "Positively." "What are you playing there?" It was Mrs. Packard who spoke. She was pointing at the scribble he was making on the paper. Tit-tat-toe," he smiled, "to amuse the baby." Did she hate to see him so occupied, or was her own restlessness of a nature demanding a like outlet? Tearing her eyes away from him and the child, she looked about her in a wild way, till she came upon a box of matches standing on the large centre table around which they were all grouped. Taking some in her hand, she commenced to lay them out on a table before her, possibly in attempt to attract the baby's attention to herself. Puerile business, but it struck me forcibly, possibly for the effect it appeared to have on the mayor. Looking from one to the other in an astonishment which was not without its hint of some new and overmastering feeling on his own part, he remarked, "Isn't it time for the baby to go to bed? Surely our talk is too serious to be interrupted by games to please a child." Without a word, Mr. Steele rose and put the protesting child in the mother's arms. She, rising, carried it to the door, and, coming back slowly, reseated herself before the table and began to push the matches about again with fingers that trembled beyond her control. The mayor proceeded as if no time had elapsed since his last words. "You had some words, then, with this Brainard? I think you called him Brainard. Exacted some promise from him?" "Yes, your honor," was the only reply. "Did not Mrs. Packard speak too? We all seemed to think so, for we turned toward her, but she gave no evidence of having said anything, though an increased nervousness was visible in her fingers as she pushed the matches about. I thought I was warranted in doing so much," continued Mr. Steele. "I could not buy the man with money, so I used threats." "Right, anything to squelch him," exclaimed the mayor, but not with the vigor I expected from him. Some doubt, some dread, caught perhaps from his wife's attitude or expression, seemed to interpose between his indignation and the object of it. "You are our good friend, Steele, in spite of the shock you gave us a moment ago." As no answer was made to this beyond a smile too subtle and too fine to be understood by his open-hearted chief, the mayor proceeded to declare, "Then that matter is at an end. I pray that it may have done us no real harm. I do not think it has. People resent attacks on women, especially on one whose reputation has never known a shadow as girl, wife, or mother." "Yes," came the slow assent from the lips which had just smiled, and he glanced at Mrs. Packard, whose own lips seemed suddenly to become dry, for I saw her try to moisten them as her right hand groped about for something on the table top, and finally settled on a small paperweight, which she set down amongst her matches. Was it then or afterward that I began to have my first real doubt whether some shadow had not fallen across her apparently unsullied life? "Yes, you're right," repeated Mr. Steele more energetically. "People do resent such insinuations against a woman, though I remember one case where the opposite effect was produced. It was when Collins ran for supervisor in Cleveland. He was a good fellow himself, and he had a wife who was all that was beautiful and charming, but who had once risked her reputation in an act which did call for public arraignment. Unfortunately, there was a man who knew of this act, and he published it right and left, and Olympia!" Mayor Packard was on his feet, pointing in sudden fury and suspicion at the table where the matches lay about in odd and, as I now saw, seemingly set figures. "You are doing something besides playing with those matches. I know Mr. Steele's famous cipher. He showed it to me a week ago, and so, evidently, do you, in spite of the fact that you have had barely 50 words with him since he came to the house. Let me read. Give over that piece of paper you have there, Steele, if you would not have me think you as great a dastard as we know that Brainard to be." And while his wife drooped before his eyes, and a cynical smile crept about the secretary's fine mouth, he caught up the sheet on which Steele had been playing tit-tat-toe with the child, and glanced from the table to it, and back again to the table on which the matches lay, in the following device, the paperweight answering for the dot. M suddenly left the mayor's writhing lips, then slowly, letter by letter, E.R.C.Y. "Mercy!" he vociferated. "Why does my wife appeal for mercy to you, a stranger, and in your own cipher? Miserable woman, what secret's here? Either you are—" "Hush! Someone's at the door," admonished the secretary. Mr. Packard turned quickly, and smoothing his face rapidly, as such men must, started for the door. Mrs. Packard, flinging her whole soul into a look, met the secretary's eyes for a moment, and then let her head sink forward on her hands above those telltale matches, from whose arrangement she had reaped despair in place of hope. Mr. Steele smiled again, his fine, false smile, but after her head had fallen, not before. Indeed, he had vouchsafed no reply to her eloquent look. It was as if he had met marble till her eyes were bidden. But Nixon was in the open doorway, and Nixon was speaking. "A telegram, your honor." The old man spoke briskly, even a little crisply. Perhaps he always did when he addressed the mayor, but his eyes roamed eagerly and changed to a burning red color when they fell upon the dejected figure of the mistress. I fancied that, had he dared, he would have leapt into the room and taken his own part, and who could rightly gauge what that was, in the scene which may have been far more comprehensive to him than to me. But he did not dare, and my eyes passed from him to the mayor. "From Haines," that gentleman announced, forgetting the suggestive discovery he had just made in the great and absorbing interest of his campaign. "Speech good, great applause, becoming thunderous at flash of your picture. All right so far if," he read out, ceasing abruptly at the "if," which, as I afterward understood, really ended the message. "No answer," he explained to Nixon, as he hurriedly dismissed him. "That 'if' concerns you," he now declared, coming back to his wife and to his troubles at the same instant. "Explain the mystery which seems likely to undo me. Why do you sit there bowed under my accusations? Why should Henry Packard's wife cry for mercy to any man? Because those damnable accusations are true? Because you have a secret in your past, and this man knows it?" Slowly she rose. Slowly she met his eyes, and even he started back at her pallor and the drawn misery in her face. But she did not speak. Instead of that, she simply reached out and laid her hand on Mr. Steele's arm, drooping almost to the ground as she did so. "Mercy!" she suddenly wailed, but this time to the man who had so relentlessly accused her. The effect was appalling. The mayor reeled, then sprang forward with his hand outstretched for his secretary's throat. But his words were for his wife. "What does this mean? Why do you take your stand by the side of another man than myself? What have I done, or what have you done, that I should live to face such an abomination as this?" It was Steele who answered, with a lift of his head as full of assertion as it was of triumph. "You, nothing. She, everything. You do not know this woman, Mayor Packard. For instance, you do not know her name." "Not know her name? My wife's? Not in the least. This lady's name is Brainard. So is mine. Though she has lived with you several years in ignorance of my continued existence, no doubt she is my wife and not yours. We were married in Boone, Minnesota, 6 years ago." End of chapter 22.
Wife. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bethany Simpson. The Mayor's Wife by Anna Katharine Green. Chapter 23, The Wife's Tale. 10 minutes later, this woman was pleading her cause. She had left the side of the man who had just assumed the greatest of all rights over her, and was standing in a frenzy of appeal before him she loved so deeply, and yet had apparently wronged. Mayor Packard was sitting with his head in his hands in the chair into which he had dropped when the blow fell which laid waste his home, his life, the future of his child, and possibly the career which was as much, perhaps more, to him than all of these. He had not uttered a word since that dreadful moment. To all appearance, her moans of contrition fell upon deaf ears, and she had reached the crisis of her misery without knowing the extent of the condemnation hidden in his persistent silence. Collapse seemed inevitable, but I did not know the woman or the really wonderful grip she held on herself. Seeing that he was moved by nothing she had said, she suddenly paused, and presently I heard her observe in quite a different tone, "There is one thing you must know, which I thought you would know without my telling you. I have never lived with this man, and I believed him dead when I gave my hand to you." The mayor's fingers twitched. She had touched him at last. "Speak. Tell me," he murmured hoarsely. "I do not want to do you any injustice." "I shall have to begin far, far back, tell about my early life and all its temptations," she faltered, "or you will never understand. Speak." Sensible at this point of the extreme impropriety of my presence, I rose with an apology to leave, but she shook her head quickly, determinedly, saying that as I had heard so much, I must hear more. Then she went on with her story. "I have committed a great fault," said she, "but not one so deep or inexcusable as now appears, whatever that man may say," she added with a slow turn toward the silent secretary. Did she expect to provoke a reply from the man who, after the first triumphant assertion of his claim, had held himself as removed from her and as unresponsive to her anguish as he whom she directly addressed? If so, she must have found her disappointment bitter, for he did not respond with so much as a look. He may have smiled, but if so, it was not a helpful smile, for she turned away with a shudder and henceforth faced and addressed the mayor only. "My mother married against the wishes of all her family, and they never forgave her. My father died early. He had never got on in the world, and before I was 15, I became the sole support of my invalid mother, as well as of myself. We lived in Boone, Minnesota. You can imagine what sort of support it was, as I had no special talent, no training, and only the opportunity given by a crude western town of 200 or 300 inhabitants. I washed dishes in the hotel kitchen. I, who had a millionaire uncle in Detroit and had been fed on tales of wealth and culture by a mother who remembered her own youth and was too ignorant of my real nature to see the harm she was doing. I washed dishes and ate my own heart out in shame and longing, bitter shame and frenzied longing, which you must rate at their full force if you would know my story and how I became linked to this man. I was 16 when we first met. He was not then what he is now, but he was handsome enough to create an excitement in town and to lift the girl he singled out into an enviable prominence. Unfortunately, I was that girl. I say unfortunately because his good looks failed to arouse in me more than a passing admiration, and in accepting his attentions I consulted my necessities and pride rather than the instincts of my better nature. When he asked me to marry him, I recoiled. I did not know why then, nor did I know why later, but know why now. However, I let this premonition pass and engaged myself to him, and the one happy moment I knew was when I told my mother what I had done, and saw her joy, and heard the hope with which she impulsively cried, "It is something I can write your uncle. Who knows? Perhaps he may forgive me my marriage when he hears that my child is going to do so well." Poor mother! She had felt the glamour of my lover's good looks and cleverness much more than I had. She saw from indications to which I was blind that I was going to marry a man of mark, and was much more interested in the possible reply she might receive to the letter with which she had broken the silence of years between herself and her family than in the marriage itself. But days passed, a week, and no answer came. My uncle, the only relative remaining in which we could hope to awaken any interest, or rather the only one whose interest would be worth awakening, he being a millionaire and unmarried, declined, it appeared, any communication with one so entirely removed from his sympathies, and the disappointment of it broke my mother's heart. Before my wedding day came, she was lying in the bare cemetery I had passed so often, with a cold dread in my young and bounding heart. With her loss, the one true and unselfish bond which held me to my lover was severed, and known to him, perhaps he hears it now for the first time, I had many hours of secret hesitation which might have ended in a positive refusal to marry him if I had not been afraid of his anger and the consequences of an open break. With all his protestations of affection and the very ardent love he made me, he had not succeeded in rousing my affections. But he had my fears. I knew that to tell him to his face I would not marry him would mean death to him and possibly to myself. Such intuition, young as I was, did I have of his character, though I comprehended so little the real range of his mind and the unswerving trend of his ambitious nature. So my wedding day came, and we were united in the very hotel where I had so long served in a menial capacity. the social distinctions in such a place being small, and my birth and breeding really placing me on par with my employer and his family, I was given the parlor for this celebration, and never, never shall I forget its mean and bare look, even to my untutored eyes, or how lonely those far hills looked through the small paned window I faced, or what a shadow seemed to fall across them as the parson uttered those fateful words, so terrible to one whose heart is not in them. What God hath joined together, let no man put asunder. Death and not life awaited me on that bleak hillside, or so I thought, though the bridegroom at my side was the handsomest man I'd ever seen, and had rather exceeded than failed in his devotion to me as a lover. The ceremony over, I went upstairs to make my final preparations for departure. No bridesmaids or real friends had lent joy to the occasion, and when I closed that parlor door upon my bridegroom and the 2 or 3 neighbors and boon companions with whom he was making merry, I found myself alone with my dead heart and a most unwelcome future. I remember as the lock clicked and the rude hall, ruder even than the wretched, half-furnished room I had just left, opened before me, a sensation of terror at leaving even this homely refuge, and a half-formed wish that I was going back to my dishwashing in the kitchen. It was therefore with a shock, which makes my brain reel yet, that I saw, lying on a little table which I had to pass, a letter directed to myself, bearing the postmark, Detroit. What might there not be in it? What? Gasping as much with fear as delight, I caught up the letter, and rushing with it to my room, locked myself in and tore open the envelope. A single sheet fell out. It was signed with the name I had heard whispered in my ear from early childhood, and always in connection with riches and splendor and pleasures. It was rapture to dream of. This was an agitation in itself, but the words, I have never told them to mortal being, but I must tell them now. I remember them as I remember the look of my child's face when she was first put in my arms. The child. She had underrated her strength. She broke into a storm of weeping, which shook to the very soul one of the 2 men who listened to her, though he made no move to comfort her or allay it. The alienation thus expressed produced its effect, and stricken deeper than the fount of tears, she suddenly choked back every sob and took up the thread of her narrative with the calmness born of despair. These were the words, these and no others. If my niece will break all ties and come to me completely unhampered, she may hope to find a permanent home in my house and a close hold upon my affections. Ira T. Houttailing. Unhampered, with the marriage vow scarcely cold on my lips, without tie, and a husband waiting below to take me to his home on the hillside. A hillside so bare and bleak that the sight of it had sent a shudder to my heart as the wedding ring touched my finger. The irony of the situation was more than I could endure, and alone with my eyes fixed on the comfortless heavens, showing gray and cold through the narrow panes of my windows, I sank to the floor insensible. When I came to myself, I was still alone, and the twilight a little more pronounced than when my misery had turned it to blackest midnight. Rising, I read that letter again, and plainly as the acknowledgment betrays the selfishness lying at the basis of my character, the temptation which thereupon seized me had never an instant of relenting or one conscientious scruple to combat it. I simply, at that stage in my life and experience, could not do otherwise than I did. Saying to myself that vows as empty of heart as mine were void before God and man, I sat down and wrote a few words to the man whose step on the stair I dreaded above anything else in the world, and leaving the note on the table, unlocked my door and looked out. The hall connecting with my room was empty, but not so the lower one. There I could hear voices and laughter. Mr. Brainard's, loud above all the rest, a fatal sound to me, cutting off all escape in that direction. But another way offered, and that one near at hand. Communicating with the very hall in which I stood was an outside staircase running down to the road, a means of entering and leaving a house which I never see now wherever I may encounter it, without a gush of inward shame and terror, so instinctive and so sharp that I have never been able to hide it from anyone whose eyes might chance to be upon me at the moment. But that night I was conscious of no shame, barely of any terror. only of the necessity for haste. The train on which I was determined to fly was due in a little less than an hour at a station 2 miles down the road. That I should be followed farther than the turbulent steam which crossed the road only a quarter of a mile from the hotel, I did not fear. For in the hurried note I had left behind me, I had bidden them to look for me there, saying that I had been precipitate in marrying one I did not really love, and overcome by a sense of my mistake, I was resolved on death. A lie. But what was a lie to me then, who saw in my life with this man an amelioration of my present state, but an amelioration only? While in the prospects held out to me by my uncle, I foresaw not only release from my hated union, but every delight which my soul had craved since my mother could talk to me of wealth and splendor. Behold me, then, stealing down the side of the house in a darkness which during the last few minutes had become impenetrable. A shadow, where all was shadowy. I made for the woods and succeeded in reaching their shelter, just as there rose in the distance behind me that most terrible of all sounds to a woman's ear, a man's loud cry of anguish and rage. She was not looking at that man now, but I was. As these words left her lips, Mr. Steele's hand crept up and closed over his heart, though his face was like that of marble, set in immovable lines. I feared him, I admired him, and found myself still looking at him as she went gaspingly on. Reckless of the dangers of the road, fearing nothing but what pressed upon me from behind, I flew straight for the stream, on whose verge I meant then to stop, and having by some marvel of good luck or providence reached it without a mishap. I tore the cloak from my shoulders, and affixing one end to the broken edge of the bridge, flung the other into the water. Then with one loud, ear-piercing shriek thrown back on the wind, "See, I tell all, I leave nothing out," I fled away in the direction of the station. For some reason, I had great confidence in the success of this feint, and soon was conscious of but one fear, and that was being recognized by the station master, who knew my face and figure even if he did not know my new city-made dress. So when I had made sure by the clock visible from the end window that I was in ample time for the expected train, I decided to remain in the dark at the end of the platform till the cars were about starting, and then to jump on and buy my ticket from the conductor. But I never expected such an interminable wait. Minute after minute went by without a hint of preparation for the advancing train. The hour for leaving arrived, passed, and not a man had shown himself on the platform. Had a change been made in the timetable? If so, what a prospect lay before me. Autumn nights are chill in Minnesota. And my cloak having been sacrificed, I found poor protection in my neat but far from warm serge dress. However, I did not fully realize my position till another passenger arrived late and panting, and I heard someone shout out to him from the open door that an accident had occurred below, and that it would be 5 hours at least before the train would come through. 5 hours, and no shelter in sight save the impossible one of the station itself. How could I pass away that time? How endure the cold and fatigue? By pacing to and fro in the road? I tried it, resolutely tried it for an hour. Then a new terror, a new suspense gripped me, and I discovered that I could never live through the hours, never, in fact, take the train when it came without knowing what had happened in Boone, and whether the feint on which I relied had achieved its purpose. There was time to steal back, time to see and hear what would satisfy me of my own safety, and then to have some purpose in my movement. How much better than this miserable pacing back and forth, just to start the stagnating blood and make the lagging moments endurable? So I turned again toward Boone. I was not in the mood to fear darkness or any encounter save one, and experienced hesitation only when I found myself reapproaching the bridge. Shadows which had protected me until now failed me there, and it was with caution that I finally advanced and emerged upon the open spot where the road crossed the river. But even this was not needed. In the wide stretch before me, cut by the inky stream, I saw no signs of life, and it was not till I was on the bridge itself that I discerned in the black hollows below the glint of a lantern, lighting up the bending forms of 2 or 3 men who were dragging at something which heaved under their hands with the pull of the stream. It was a sight which has never left me, but one which gave wings to my feet that night and sent me flying on till a fork in the road brought me to a standstill. To the left lay the hotel, I could see its windows glimmering with faint lights, while away to the right there broke upon me from the hillside a solitary sparkle. But this sparkle came from the house where, but for the letter hidden in my heart, I should be sitting at this moment before my own fireside. What moved me? God knows. It may have been duty. It may have been curiosity. It may have been only dread to know the worst and to know it at once. But seeing that single gleam, I began to move toward it. And before I was aware, I had reached the house, edged up to its unshaded window, and taken a frightened look within. I was prepared and yet unprepared for what I saw. Within, standing alone, with garments dripping, gazing in frenzy at a slip of paper which clung wet about his hand, stood my husband, my words to him. I could see it in his eyes and the desperation which lit up all his features. Drawing back in terror from the road, I watched him fling that letter from his fingers as he would a biting snake, and striding to a cupboard high up on the wall, take something down I could not see and did not guess until the sharp sound of a pistol shot cleft my ear, and I beheld him fall face downward on the carpet of fresh autumn leaves with which he had hidden the bare floor in expectation of his bride. The shriek which involuntarily went up from my lips must have rung far and wide, but only the groaning of the night wind answered me. Driven by my fears to do something to save him if he was not yet dead, I tried the door, but it was locked, and so was the window. Yet I might have battered my way in at that moment, had I not heard two men coming down the road, one of whom was shouting to the other, "I did not like his face. I shan't sleep till I've seen him again." Somewhat relieved, I drew back from the road and did not quit the spot till those men, seeing through the window what had happened, worked their way in and lifted him up in their arms. The look with which they let him fall back again was eloquent, and convinced me that it was death I saw. I started again upon my shuddering flight from Boone, secure in the belief that while my future would surely hold remorse for me, it would never more burden me with a hindrance in the shape of an unloved husband. End of chapter 23. Recorded by Bethany Simpson in Los Angeles in October 2012. Of the Mayor's Wife. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bethany Simpson. The Mayor's Wife by Anna Katharine Green. Chapter 24, The Sins of the Fathers. The suspense, which had held us tense and speechless, was for the moment relieved, and Mr. Steele allowed himself the following explanation. My hand trembled, and the bullet penetrated an inch too high. Then he relapsed again into silence. Mrs. Packard shuddered and went on. It may seem incredible to you. It seems incredible now to myself, but I completed my journey, entered my uncle's house, was made welcome there, and started upon my new life without letting my eyes fall for one instant on the columns of a newspaper. I did not dare to see what they contained. That short but bitter episode of my 16th year was a nightmare of horror, to be buried with my old name and all that could interfere with the delights of the cultured existence which my uncle's means and affection opened before me. 2 years, and I hardly remembered. 3 years, and it came to me only in dreams. 4, and even dreams failed to suggest it. The present, the glorious present, was all. I had met you, Henry, and we had loved and married. Did any doubts come to disturb my joy? Very few. I had never received a word from Minnesota. I was as dead to everyone there as they all were to me. I believed myself free, and that the only wrong I did was in not taking you into my confidence. But this, the very nature of my secret, forbade. How could I tell you what would inevitably alienate your affections? That act of my early girlhood by which I had gained an undeserved freedom had been too base. Sooner than let you know this blot on my life, I was content to risk the possibility, the inconceivable possibility, of Mr. Brainard's having survived the attack he made upon his own life. Can you understand such temerity? I cannot, now that I see its results before me. So the die was cast, and I became the wife instead of the mere shadow of one. You were prosperous, and not a sorrow came to disturb my sense of complete security till that day 2 weeks ago when, looking up in my own library, I saw, gleaming between me and the evening lamp, a face, which, different as it was in many respects, tore my dead past out of the grave and sent my thoughts reeling back to a lonely road on a black hillside with a lighted window in view, and behind that window the outstretched form of a man with his head among leaves not redder than his blood. I've said to others, that a specter rose upon me that day in the library. It was such to me, an apparition and nothing else. Perhaps he meant to impress himself as such, for I had heard no footfall, and only looked up because of the constraining force of the look which awaited me. I knew afterward that it was a man whom I had seen, a man whom you yourself had introduced into the house, but at the instant I thought it a phantom of my forgotten past sent to shock and destroy me. And struck speechless with the horror of it, I lost that opportunity of mutual explanation which might have saved me an unnecessary and cruel experience. For this man, who recognized me more surely than I did him, who perhaps knew who I was even before he entered the house, had sported for 2 weeks with my fears and my hopes as a tiger with his prey. Maintaining his attitude of stranger, you've been witness to his manner in my presence, he led me slowly but surely to believe myself deceived by an extraordinary resemblance. A resemblance, moreover, which he did not hold at all times, and which frequently vanished altogether, as I recalled the straight-featured but often uncouth aspect of the man who had awakened the admiration of Boone. Memory had been awakened and my sleep filled with dreams, but the unendurable had been spared me, and I was thanking God with my whole heart, when suddenly one night, when an evening spent with friends in the old way had made me feel safe, my love safe, my husband and my child safe, there came to my ears from below the sound of a laugh, loud, coarse, and deriding, such a laugh as could spring from no member of my own household, such a laugh as I heard but once before, and that in the bygone years, when someone asked Mr. Brainard if he meant to live always in Boone. The shock was terrible. And when I learned that the secretary, and the secretary only, was below, I knew who that secretary was, and yielded to the blow. Yet hope dies hard with the happy. I knew, but it was not enough to know. I must be sure. There was a way. It came to me with my first fluttering breath as I recovered from my faint. In those old days, when I was thrown much with this man, he had shown me a curious cipher and taught me how to use it. It was original with himself, he said, and some day we might be glad of a method of communication which would render our correspondence inviolable. I could not see why he considered this likely ever to be desirable, but I took the description of it which he gave me and promised that I would never let it leave my person. I even allowed him to solder about my neck the chain which held the locket in which he had placed it. Consequently, I had it with me when I fled from Boone, and for the first few weeks of arriving at my uncle's house in Detroit. Then, wishing to banish every reminder of the days that I was so anxious to forget, I broke that chain, destroyed the locket, and hid away from everyone's sight the now useless and despised cipher. Why I retained the cipher, I cannot explain. Now that cipher must prove my salvation. If I could find it again, I was sure that the shock of receiving from my hand certain words written in the symbols he himself had taught me would call from him an involuntary revelation. I should know what I had to fear. But so many changes had taken place and so long a time elapsed since I hid this slip of paper away that I was not even sure I still retained it. But after spending a good share of the night in searching for it, I finally came across it in one of my old trunks. The next morning I made my test. Perhaps, Henry, you remember my handing Mr. Steele an empty envelope to mail when he returned with an air of surprise, so natural and seemingly unfeigned that he again forced me to believe that he was the stranger he appeared. Though he must have recognized at a glance, for he was an adept in this cipher once, the 7 simple symbols in which I had expressed the great cry of my soul. Is it you? He acted the innocent secretary so perfectly that all my old hopes returned and I experienced 1 hour of perfect joy. Then came another reaction. Letty brought in the baby with a paper pinned to her coat. She declared to us that a woman had been the instrument of this outrage, though the marks inside, suggesting the cipher but with characteristic variations bespeaking malice, could only have been made by one hand. How I managed to maintain sufficient hold upon my mind to drag the key from my breast and by its means to pick out the meaning of the first 3 words, words which once read suggested all the rest, I cannot now imagine. Death was in my heart, and the misery of it all more than human strength could bear. Yet I compared paper with paper carefully, intelligently, till these words from the prayer book with all their threatening meaning to me, and mine started into life before me. Visiting the sins. Henry, you know the words. Visiting the sins of the fathers upon the children unto the 3rd and 4th generation. Upon the children. Henry, he meant Laura, our little Laura. I had wakened vengeance in a fiend. The man who had calmly smiled in my face as he handed me back that empty envelope inscribed with the wild appeal, "Is it you?" was the man I had once driven to the verge of the grave and who had come back now to destroy us all. Yet, such is the reaching out of the drowning for straws, I still did not utterly despair till Nixon brought me from this man's lodging house where I had sent him a specimen of his handwriting. Nixon is the only confidant I have had. Nixon knew me as a girl when he worked in my uncle's home and has always had the most unbounded, I may say jealous, affection for me. To him I had dared impart that I did not trust your new secretary, that he looked like a man I once knew who was a determined opponent of the party now trying to elect you, that a specimen of his writing would make me quite sure, and begged him to get it. I thought he might pick up such in the little office below, but he was never able to do so. Mr. Steele has taken care not to leave a line written in this house. But he did find a few lines signed with his name in his own room at the boarding house, and these he showed me before he told me the result of his errand. They settled all doubts. What is to be my fate? Surely this man has no real claim on me, after all these years, when I thought myself your true and honest wife. He may ruin your campaign, defeat your hopes, overwhelm me with calumny and a loss of repute, but surely he cannot separate us. The law will not uphold him in that, will it? Henry, say that it will not. Say that it will not do that, or we shall live to curse the day, not when we were born, but when our little innocent child came to us. End of chapter 24, recorded by Bethany Simpson in Los Angeles in October 2012. Wife. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bethany Simpson. The Mayor's Wife by Anna Katharine Green. Chapter 25, The Finger on the Wall. At this appeal, the mayor rose and faced his secretary, and the spectacle was afforded me of seeing 2 strong men drawn up in conflict over a woman both had cherished above all else. And it was characteristic of the forceful men, as well as the extreme nature of the conflict, that both were quiet in manner and speech. Perhaps the mayor the more so, as he began the struggle by saying, "Is what Mrs. Packard says of your playing with her fears during these 2 weeks true, Mr. Steele?" Without a droop of his eye or a tremor in his voice, the answer came short, sharp, and emphatic. "Yes." "Then you are a villain, and I shall not feel myself called upon to show you any consideration beyond what justice demands. Have you any plea to urge beyond the natural one of her seemingly unprovoked desertion of you? Has not my wife," the nobility with which he emphasized those 2 words made my heart swell, "spoken the truth?" Ah, then the mask of disdainful serenity with which the other had hitherto veiled the burning anguish of his soul fell in one burst of irresistible passion. "True! Yes, it is true! But what does that truth involve for me? Not 2 weeks, but 7 years of torture, 5 of them devoted to grief for her loss, and 2 to rage and bitter revulsion against her whole sex when I found her alive, and myself the despised victim of her deception. She wronged you, she acknowledges that, but it was the wrong of an unthinking child, not of a realizing woman. Would you, a realizing man, tear her now from home, from her child, from her place in the community and my heart, make her despicable as well as unhappy, just to feed your revenge? Yes, I would do that. jeopardize interests you have so often professed in my hearing to be far above personal consideration, the success of your party, the triumph of your political principles? My political principles? Oh, the irony of his voice, the triumph in his laugh. And what do you know of them? What have I said, Mayor Packard? Your education as a politician has yet to be completed before you will be fit for the governorship of a state. I am an adept at the glorification of the party, of the man that it suits my present exigencies to promote. But it is a faculty which should have made you pause before you trusted me with the furtherance and final success of a campaign which may outlast those exigencies. I've not always been of your party. I am not so now at heart. The mayor, outraged in every sentiment of honor as well as in the most cherished feelings of his heart, lowered upon his unmoved secretary with a wrath which would have borne down any other man before it. Do you mean to say, that your work is a traitor's work? That the glorification you speak of is false? That you may talk in my favor, but that when you come to the issue you will vote according to your heart, that is, for Stanton? I have succeeded in making myself intelligible. The mayor flushed. Indignation gave him vehemence. Then, he cried, I take back the word by which I qualified you a moment ago. You are not a villain. You are a dastard. Mr. Steele bowed in a way which turned the opprobrium into a seeming compliment. I have suffered so many wrongs at your hands that I cannot wonder at suffering this one more. Then slowly and with a short look at her, the woman who has queened it so long in C, society cannot wish to undergo the charge of bigamy? You will bring such a charge? Certainly, if she does not voluntarily quit her false position and, accepting the protection of the man whose name is really hers, go from this house at once. At this alternative, uttered with icy deliberation, Mrs. Packard recoiled with a sharp cry. But the mayor thrust a sudden sarcastic query at his opponent. Which name? Steele or Brainerd? You acknowledged both. My real name is Brainerd, therefore it is also hers. But I shall be content if she will take my present one of Steele. More than that, I shall be content if she will honestly accept from my hands a place of refuge where I swear she will remain unmolested by me till this matter can be legally settled. I do not wish to make myself hateful to her, for I anticipate the day when she will be my wife in heart as she is now in law. Never! The word rang out in true womanly revolt. I will die before that day ever comes to separate me from the man I love and the child who calls me mother. You may force me from this house, you may plunge me into poverty, into contumely, but you will never make me look upon myself as other than the wife of this good man whom I've wronged, but will never disgrace. Madam, declared the inflexible secretary, with a derisive appreciation which bowed her once proud head upon her shamed breast, you are all I thought you, when I took you from Crabbe's back pantry in Boone to make you the honor and glory of a life which I knew then, as well I do now, would not long run at obscure channels. It was a sarcasm calculated to madden the proud man who only a few minutes before had designated the object of it by the sacred name of wife. But beyond a hasty glance at the woman it had bowed almost to the ground, the mayor gave no evidence of feeling either its force or assumption. Other thoughts were in his mind than those roused by jealous anger. How old were you then? He demanded with alarming incongruity. The secretary started. He answered, however, calmly enough, I? 7 years ago I was 25. I am 32 now. So I've heard you say. A man of 25 is old enough to have made a record, Mr. Steele. The mayor's tone hardened. So did his manner. And I saw why he had been such a power in the courts before he took up politics and an office. Mr. Steele, I do not mean you to disturb my house or to rob me of my wife. What was your life before you met Olympia Brewster? A pause, the slightest in the world, but the keen eye of the astute lawyer noted it, and his tone grew in severity and assurance. You have known for 2 years that this woman whom you called yours was within your reach, if not under your very eye, and you forbore to claim her. Has this delay had anything to do with the record of those years to which I have just alluded? Had the random shot told? The secretary's eye did not falter, nor his figure lose an inch of its height. Yet the impression made by his look and attitude were not the same. The fire had gone out of them. A blight had struck his soul. The flush of his triumph was gone. Mayor Packard was merciless. Only two considerations could hold back a man like you from urging a claim he regarded as a sacred right: the fact of a former marriage or the remembrance of a forfeited citizenship. Pardon me, we cannot mince matters in a strait like this, which would delegalize whatever contract you may have entered into. Still, the secretary's eye did not swerve, though he involuntarily stretched forth his hand toward the table, as if afraid of betraying a tremor in his rigidly drawn-up figure. Was there the impediment of a former marriage? No answer from the sternly set lips. Or was it that you once served a term, a very short term, cut short by a successful attempt at escape in a Minnesota prison? Insults broke from those set lips, and nothing more. Mr. Steele, I practiced law in that state for a period of 3 years. All the records of the office and of the prison register are open to me. Over which of them should I waste my time? Then the tiger broke loose in the man, who from the aggressor had become the attacked, and he cried, I shall never answer. The devil has whispered his own suggestions in your ear. The devil and nothing else. But the mayor, satisfied that he had made his point, smiled calmly, saying, No, not the devil, but yourself. You, even the you of 7 years back, would not have lived in any country town if necessity, or let us say safety, had not demanded it. You, with your looks and your ambitions, to marry at 25 a girl from the kitchen. Any girl, even if she had had the making of an Olympia Packard, if you had not known what was in your power to shake her off when you got ready to assert yourself or better prospects offered? The cipher and the desirability you expressed at a means of communication unreadable save by you two, all this was enough to start the suspicion. Your own manner has done the rest. Mr. Steele, you are both a villain and a bastard, and have no right in law to this woman. Contradict me if you dare. I dare, but will not, was the violent reply. I shall not give you even that satisfaction. This woman who has gone through the ceremony of marriage with both of us shall never know to which of us she is the legal wife. Perhaps it is as good a revenge as the other. It certainly will interfere as much with her peace. Oh, not that! I cannot bear that! Leapt in anguish from her lips. I am a pure woman. Let no such torture be inflicted upon me. Speak, tell the truth as you are the son of a woman who would have believed you honest. A smile then, cold but alive with gloating triumph, altered the straight line of his lips for an instant as he advanced toward the door. A woman over the possession of whom it is an honor to quarrel, were his words as he passed the mayor with a bow. I looked to see the mayor spring and grasp him by the throat, but that was left for another hand. As the secretary bent to touch the door, it suddenly flew violently open, and Nixon, quivering in every limb and with his face afire, sprang in and seized upon the other with a violence of passion which would have been deadly had there been any strength behind it. It was but child's play for so strong a man as Mr. Steele to shake off so futile a grasp, and he did so with a rasping laugh. But the next moment he was tottering, blanched and helpless, and while struggling to right himself and escape, yielded more and more to a sudden weakness sapping his life vigor, till he fell prone and apparently lifeless on the lounge toward which, with a final effort, he had thrown himself. Good! Good! Rang thrilling through the room as the old man reeled back from the wall against which he had been cast. God has finished what these old arms had only strength enough to begin. He's dead this time, and it's a mercy. Thank God, Miss Olympia. Thank God, as I do now on my knees. But here, catching the mayor's eye, he faltered to his feet again, saying humbly as he crept away, I couldn't help it, Your Honor. I shouldn't have been listening at the door, but I have loved Miss Olympia, as we used to call her, more than anything else in the world since ever she came to make my old master's house a place of sunshine. And all I'm sorry for is that God had to do the finishing, which 20 years ago I could have done myself. End of chapter 25, recorded by Bethany Simpson in Los Angeles in October 2012.
Chapter 26 of The Mayor's Wife. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Mayor's Wife by Katharine Green. Chapter 26. Bitter as the Grave. But Nixon was wrong. Mr. Steele did not die. Not this time. Cared for by the physician who had been hastily summoned, he slowly but surely revived, and by midnight was able to leave the house. As he passed the mayor on his way out, I heard Mr. Packard say, "I shall leave the house myself in a few minutes. I do not mean that your disaffection shall ruin my campaign any more than I mean to leave a stone unturned to substantiate my accusations that you had no right to marry and possess legal claims over the woman whose happiness you have endeavored to wreck. If you are wise, you will put no further hindrance in my way." I heard no answer, for at that instant a figure appeared in the open door, which distracted all our attention. Miss Thankful, never an early sleeper, and much given, as we know, to looking out of her window, had evidently caught the note of disaster from the coming and going of the doctor. She had run in from next door, and now stood panting in the open doorway, face to face with Mr. Steele, with her two hands held out, in one of which, remarkable as it seems to relate, I saw the package of bonds which I had been fortunate enough to find for her. The meeting seemed to paralyze both. Her face, which had been full of tremulous feeling, blanched and hardened, while he, stopped in some speech or final effort he was about to make, yielded to the natural brutality which underlay his polished exterior, and, in an access of rage which almost laid him prostrate again, lifted his arm and struck her out of his path. As she reeled to one side, the bonds flew from her hand and lay at his feet, but he saw nothing. He was already halfway down the walk, and in another moment the bang of his carriage door announced his departure. The old lady, muttering words I could not hear, stared mute and stricken at the bonds, which the mayor had hastened to lift and place in her hands. Pitying her and anxious to relieve him from the embarrassment of her presence when his own mind and heart were full of misery, I rushed down to her side and endeavored to lead her away. She yielded patiently enough to my efforts, but as she turned away, she cast one look at the mayor, and with the tears rolling down her long and hollow cheeks, murmured in horror and amaze, "He struck me!" The flash in Mayor Packard's eye showed sympathy, but the demands of the moment were too great for him to give to those pathetic words the full significance which I suddenly suspected them to hold. As I led her tottering figure down the step and turned toward her door, I said gently, "Who was the man? Who was it that struck you?" She answered quickly and with broken-hearted emphasis, "My nephew! My sister's son! And I had come to give him all our money. We have waited 3 days for him to come to us. We thought he would when he knew the bonds had been found, but he never came near, never gave us a chance to enrich him. When I heard he was ill and saw the carriage which had come to take him away, we could not stand it another minute, and so I ran out, and he struck me, looked in my face, and struck me." I folded her in my arms, there and then at the foot of her own doorstep, and when I felt her heart beating on mine, I whispered, "Bless God for it. He has a hard and cruel heart, and would make no good use of this money. Live to spend it as your brother desired, to make over the old house and reinstate the old name. He would not have wished it wasted on one who must have done you cruel wrong, since he has lived so many days beside you without showing his interest in you, or even acknowledging your relationship." "There were reasons," she protested, gently withdrawing herself, but holding me for a minute to her side. "He has had great fortune, is a man of importance now. We did not wish to interfere with his career, It was only after the money was found that we felt he should come. We should not have asked him to take back his old name. We should simply have given him what he thought best to take, and been so happy and proud to see him. He is so handsome and fortunate that we should not have begrudged it if he had taken it all. But he struck me. He struck me. He will never get $1 now." Relieved, for the natural good sense of the woman was reasserting itself, I gave her hands a squeeze, and quickly ran back to where the mayor was holding the door for me. "She is all right now," I remarked, as I slid by him upstairs, and that was all I said. The rest must wait a more auspicious moment. The moment when he really would have time to take up the gage which Mr. Steele had thrown down to him in his final words. I was not a witness to the parting interview between Mayor Packard and his wife. I had stolen into the nursery for a look at the little one. I found her sleeping sweetly, with one chubby hand under her rounded cheek. Thus had she lain, and thus had she slept during all those dreadful minutes when her future hung trembling in the balance. End of chapter 26. Recording by Winna Hathaway in Fayetteville, North Carolina.
The Mayor's Wife. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bethany Simpson. The Mayor's Wife by Anna Katharine Green. Chapter 27, A Child's Playthings. I was too much overwhelmed by all these events to close my eyes that night. The revelation of Mr. Steele's further duplicity coming so immediately upon the first roused fresh surmises and awakened thoughts, which soon set my wits working in a direction as new as it was unexpected. I had believed my work over in this house, but as I recalled all the occurrences of the evening and turned the situation as it now confronted me over and over in my mind, I felt that it had just begun. There must be something in this latest development to help us in the struggle which lay before us. The rage which sprung up in him as he confronted his old aunt at this moment of his triumphant revenge argued a weakness in his armor which it might yet be my part to discover and reveal. I knew Mrs. Packard well enough to realize that the serenity into which she had fallen was a fictitious serenity, and must remain so as long as any doubt remained of the legality of the tie uniting her to this handsome fiend. Were the means suggested by the mayor of promising enough character to accomplish the looked-for end? I remembered the man's eyes as the mayor let fall his word of powerful threat, and doubted it. Once recovered from the indisposition which now weakened him, he would find means to thwart any attempt made by Mayor Packard to undermine the position he had taken as the legal husband of Olympia, sufficiently so at least to hinder happiness between the pair whose wedded life he not only envied, but was determined to break up, unless some flaw in his past could be discovered through Miss Quinlan, the aunt whose goodness he had slighted, and who now seemed to be in a frame of mind to help our cause if its pitiful aspects were once presented to her. I resolved to present the case without delay. Morning came at last, and I refreshed myself as well as I could, and after a short visit to Mrs. Packard's bedside, during which my purpose grew with every moment I gazed down on her brave but pitiful face, put on my hat and jacket, and went next door. I found the two old ladies seated in their state apartment making calculations. At sight of my face they both rose, and the "Oh, my dear," from Miss Charity, and the "God bless you, child," from Miss Thankful, showed that both hearts were yet warm. Gradually I introduced the topic of their nephew. Gradually I approached the vital question of the disgrace. The result upset my growing hopes. He had never told them just what the disgrace was. They really knew nothing about his life after his early boyhood. He had come home that one time when fortune so suddenly smiled upon them, and they thought then that he would tell them something. But the disappointment which had followed effectually closed his lips, and he went away after a few days of fruitless search, not to approach them again till just before he took up the position of secretary to their great neighbor. Then he paid them one short and peremptory visit, during which he was able to impress upon them his importance, his reason for changing his name, which they could not now remember, and the great necessity which this made for them not to come near him as their nephew. They had tried to do what he asked, but it had been hard. Charity, Miss Thankful proceeded to bewail with a forgetfulness of her own share in the matter, has not been able to keep her eyes long off the house which held, as she supposed, our double treasure. So this was all. Nothing to aid me, nothing to aid Mayor Packard. Rising in my disappointment, I prepared to leave. I had sufficient self-control, and I hope good feeling, not to add to their distress at this time by any unnecessary revelations of a past they were ignorant of, or the part this unhappy nephew of theirs had played and still promised to play in the lives of their immediate neighbors. Miss Thankful squeezed my hand, and Miss Charity gave me a kiss. Then, as she saw her sister looking aside, whispered in my ear, "I want to show you something. All of Johnny's little toys and the keepsakes he sent us when he was a good boy and loved his aunts. You will not think so badly of him then." I let Miss Charity lead me away. A drawer held all these treasures. I looked and felt to a degree the pathos of the scene, but did not give special attention to what she thrust under my eyes till she gave me a little old letter to read, soiled and torn with the handling of many years, and signed John Silverthorne Brainerd. Then something in me woke, and I stared at this signature, growing more and more excited as I realized that this was not the first time I had seen it, that somewhere and in circumstances which brought a nameless thrill I had looked upon it before, and that it was not one remembrance but many which came to me. What the spoken name had not recalled came at the sight of this written one. Bess. There was her long and continued watch over the house, once entered by her on any and every pretext, but now shunned by her with a secret terror which could not disguise her longing and its secret attraction. Her certificate of marriage. The name on this certificate, the very one I was now staring at, John Silverthorne Brainerd. Had I struck an invaluable clue? Had I, through the weakness and doting fondness of this poor woman, come upon the one link which would yet lead us to identify this hollow-hearted, false, and most vindictive man of great affairs with the wandering and worthless husband of the nondescript Bess, whose hand I had touched and whose errand I had done, little realizing its purport or the influence it would have upon our lives? I dared not believe myself so fortunate. It was much too like a fairy dream for me to rely on it for a moment. Yet the possibility was enough to rouse me to renewed effort. After we had returned to Miss Thankful's side, I asked her, with an apology for my inexhaustible curiosity, if she still felt afraid of the thread and needle woman across the way. The answer was a little sharp. "It is Charity who is afraid of her," she said. She had evidently forgotten her own extravagant words to me on this subject. "Charity is timid. She thinks because this woman once hung over our brother night and day that she knew about this money, and has persuaded herself that she has some right to it. Charity is sometimes mistaken, but she has some reason, if it is inadequate for this notion of hers. That woman, since her dismissal after my brother's death, has never really quit this neighborhood. She worked next door in any capacity she could, whenever any of the tenants would take her, and when they would not, sewed or served in the houses nearby, till finally she would set up a shop directly opposite its very door. But she'll never get these bonds. We shall pay her what is her due, but she'll never get any more." "That would make her out as a thief," I cried. "Or—" But I thought better of uttering what was in my mind. Instead, I asked how they first came to hear of her. Miss Charity showed some frustration at this and cast her sister an appealing look. But Miss Thankful, eyeing her with some severity, answered me with becoming candor. "She was a lodger in this house. We kept a few lodgers in those days. Be still, Charity. Just thank God those days are over." "A lodger," I repeated. "Did she ever tell you where she came from?" "Yes, she mentioned the place. It was some town farther west. That was when we were in such trouble about our brother and how we should care for him. She could nurse him, she said, and indeed seemed very eager to do so, and we were glad to let her. Very glad, till my brother showed such fear of her and what she might do if once she got hold of his wallet." "You possibly did her injustice," I said. "A sick man's fancies are not always to be relied on. What did your nephew think of her? Did he share your distrust of her? John? Oh, yes, I believe so. Why do we always come back to the subject of John? I want to forget him. I mean to forget him. I mean that Charity shall forget him. Let us begin then from this moment, I smiled. Then quickly, you knew that Bess was a married woman. No, we knew nothing about her. Not even the name she went by? Oh, that was Brown. Brown, I muttered, turning for a second time to go. You must think me inquisitive, but if I had not been, I added with a merry laugh, I should never have found your bonds for you. Pressing both their hands in mine, I ran hastily out of the room. At once I crossed the street to Bess's little shop. End of chapter 27. Recorded by Bethany Simpson in Los Angeles in October 2012. The Mayor's Wife. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bethany Simpson. The Mayor's Wife by Anna Katharine Green. Chapter 28, Restitution. Bess, why are you so white? What has happened to you in the last 24 hours? Have you heard from him? No, I'm all right. But her eyes, hunted and wandering, belied her words. I drew her hands down into mine across the table lying between us. I want to help you, I whispered. I think I can. Something has happened which gives me great hope. Only do me a favor first. Show me, as you promised, the papers which I dug out for you. A smile, more bitter than any tear, made her face look very hard for an instant, and then she quietly led the way into the small room at the back. When we were quite alone, she faced me again, and putting her hand to her breast, took out the much creased, much crumpled bit of paper which was her only link to youth, to her life, and to her love. This is all that will interest you, said she, her eyes brimming in spite of herself. It is my marriage certificate. The one thing that proves me an honest woman, and the equal of, she paused, biting back her words, and saying instead, of anyone I see. My husband was a gentleman. It was with trembling hands I unfolded the worn sheet. Somehow the tragedy of the lives my own had touched so nearly for the last few days had become an essential part of me. John Silverthorne Brainerd, I read. The name identical to the one I had just seen as the early signature of the man who claimed a husband rights over Mrs. Packard. The date, with what anxiety I looked at it. Preceded by 2 years, that of the time he united himself to Olympia Brewster. No proof of the utter falsity of his dishonorable claim could be more complete. As I folded up the paper and handed it back, Bess noted the change which had come to me. Panting with excitement, she cried, You look happy, happy. You know something you've not told me. What? What? I'm suffocating, mad to know. Speak, speak. Your husband is a man not unknown to any of us. You have seen him constantly. He is... Yes. Did he tell you himself? Has he done me so much justice? Oh, say that his heart has softened at last, that he is ready to recognize me, that I have not got to find these bonds. And you do not know about the bonds. Nobody does. I shouldn't have spoken. He would be angry if he knew. Angry? And I have suffered so much from his anger. He is not a gentleman. How differently she said this from the gentleman of a few minutes back. But he doesn't know that I'm here, she burst out in another instant, as I hunted for some word to say. He would kill me if he did. He once swore that he would kill me if I ever approached him or put in any claim to him till he was ready to own me for his wife and give me the place that is due me. Don't tell him that I've betrayed myself. I've been so careful, kept myself so entirely out of his eyes. Even last night when I saw the doctor go in and felt that it was for him and pictured him to myself as dying without a word from me or a look to me to help bear the pain. He was ill, wasn't he? But he got better. I saw him come out, very feeble and uncertain. Not like himself. Not like the strong and too handsome man who has wrung my heart in his hand of steel. Wrung it and thrown it away. Sobs shook her, and she stopped from lack of power to utter either her terror or her grief. But she looked the questions she could no longer put, and compassionating her misery, I gently said, "Your love has been fixed upon a very unstable heart, but you have rights which must yet ensure you his support. There is someone who will protect these rights and protect you in your efforts to substantiate them." "His aunt," she put in, shaking her head. "She can do nothing unless—" Her excitement became abnormal. "Have they found the money?" she shrieked. Have they found the money?" I could not deceive her. She'd seen it in my eye. "And they will—" "Hardly," I whispered. "He has displeased them. But they cannot be generous to him now." Her hopes sank as if the very basis of her life had been taken away. "It was my only hope," she murmured. "With that money in my hand, any of it, I could have dared his frown and won in a little while his goodwill. But now I can only anticipate rebuff. There's nothing for me to hope now. I must continue to be Bess, the thread and needle woman." "I did not say that the one to reinstate you is Miss Quinlan." Who then?" "Mayor Packard." And then I had to tell her. We all know the results of the election by which Governor Packard holds his seat. But few persons outside of those mentioned in this history know why the event of his homecoming from a trip he made to Minnesota brought a brighter and more lasting light into his wife's eyes than the news of his astonishing political triumph. He had substantiated facts by which Mr. Steele's claims upon Mrs. Packard were annulled, and Bess restored to her rights, if not to her false husband's heart and affections. There are times, though, when I do not even despair of the latter. Constant illness is producing a perceptible change in the man. And it seemed to me, from what Mrs. John Brainerd told me one day after she had been able, through the kindness of the Mrs. Quinlan, to place the amount of one of the bonds in his hands, that his eyes were beginning to learn their true lesson, and that he would yet find charm in his long-neglected wife. It was not to be wondered at, for with hope and the advantages of dress with which the Mrs. Quinlan now took pleasure in supplying her, she was gradually becoming an unusually fine woman. I remained with Mrs. Packard till they left town for the capital, remained to enjoy to the full the joy of these reunited hearts, and to receive the substantial award which they insisted on bestowing upon me. One of the tasks with which I whiled away the many hours in which I found myself alone was the understanding and proper mastery of the cipher which had played such a part in the evolution of the life drama enacted before my eyes. It was very simple. With the following diagram as a key and a single hint as to its management, you will at once comprehend its apparent intricacies. A code is written with the sentence, "The dot designated that the letter used was the second in the indicated division." The hint to which I allude is this: with every other word, the paper is turned in the hands toward the left. This alters the shape and direction of the angle or part of square symbolizing the several letters, and creates the confusion which interfered with my solution of its mysteries the night I subjected it, with such unsatisfactory results, which had elucidated the cryptogram in the gold bug. The end. End of chapter 28, recorded by Bethany Simpson in Los Angeles in October 2012. Also, the end of The Mayor's Wife by Anna Katharine Green.